Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Photo of the Week on the Daily Critique. This week's Photo of the Week was submitted by George, who's an advanced photographer from New York. We don't have the metadata on this one, but we do have the backstory, and I'm going to give you a little bit of backstory now and more later. George recently created this image on the Mindful Eye Zion National Park workshop. And what I'm going to do now is just sort of try and talk about the image objectively, like I don't know the rest of the backstory, which is important to the whole concept of this image being chosen for the photo of the week. If I was just seeing this image for the first time, I think one of the things that would really strike me is how quickly I get to the main subject, even though the main subject is very small, and even though the main subject is in an image that has a lot of high contrast space shapes and ideas. Even though there's quite a bit of contrast in the rock, there's an overall feeling of movement that moves towards the main subject. It's happening with the space shapes on the top and the bottom of the image being darker, and that framing this space shape that within it has a lot of undulation and movement of line moving towards the main subject. So it's both the idea of shape, quality of line, and then sort of a third idea, which is quality of light. You get a real strong feeling of the light is flowing through this area of the image. The other thing that really helps the main subject pop here in a pretty complicated image is color theory. You've got a sort of a predominant feeling of orange in the canyon walls, even in these darker areas is sort of a burnt orange, and then you have sort of this version of blue, and blue and orange are color complements, and it really makes the blue, even though the warm is more dominating, and even though the warm sort of comes forward more, having this little bit of blue here and having it in this sort of area that feels like a spotlight that's surrounded by some areas that are darker really makes the main subject pop out here. The other thing that I'm enjoying in the image is just within the subject of the canyon wall, there's a lot of really beautiful rhythms of textures and space shapes and qualities of line. And there's something else here that I think is really interesting. This angle on the person, which is a little bit of a profile angle. You're getting sort of this real archetypal shape of the head, this kind of arcing line, and of the shoulder and of the leg. And those qualities of line, even though they're very small, and those qualities of space shape are rhymed in big ways and in small ways in the image. It's really sort of interesting how this top space shape just ends up kind of doing this big arcing kind of serpentine curve that really plays off of the shape of the person here in this sort of semi-profile view. Now I'll give you the rest of the backstory. This image came out of an assignment to shoot a self-portrait. We went to the eastern side of Zion National Park, and along the road driving from the main canyon area sort of out of the park going east, there's some really beautiful slot canyons, several places to park and walk into those. And we had several assignments in these slot canyons, and one of those was self-portrait. The other thing that's really interesting to me about the backstory of this image is that it's a composite. If you haven't figured that out already, George took a vertical of the slot canyon and turned it horizontal, and then composited himself in here as if he's looking up at the scene horizontally when this is actually vertical. This should be the top up here, and this would be the bottom of the image. So there are a couple of things that I want to say now that we know that. One is I just think it's very, very exciting if you let yourself go from being a photographer like I was for such a long time, where I was a literalist, and I was very concerned with the way my pictures look relative to the experience that I had. You know, we're talking about some kind of version of the truth in your pictures. And when I started to allow myself to become more conceptual at the level of compositing or bringing multiple images together or just playing around with things that were more abstract, it was very freeing. And I also think that it can really sort of expand your creativity, even when you go back into a mode of really wanting to represent things, let's say, in more of a documentary way. I think it helps you to think conceptually, and to me conceptual thinking is where we get an idea in our mind, and then we go out and we work with reality to sort of make our vision come true. So that's one of the things I'd just like to challenge you with today. It's just the idea of coming up with ideas for shots in your mind's eye and then making them happen and being open to going beyond just sort of a one-frame documentary capture to do it. The other thing I'd really encourage you to consider, and hopefully you can be inspired by George's image today on this level, is to consider starting a self-portrait assignment. I've talked about this quite a bit for the last 4 or 5 years in my teaching. I think it's really powerful on a multitude of levels. Number one, I think a lot of photographers are very uncomfortable with the idea of self-portrait or just afraid to put themselves in front of their own camera. And when you go past a fear, you just grow and you expand as a person. The other thing that I think is powerful about becoming comfortable as the subject of your own pictures is I think that you develop more compassion for yourself. I'm sort of amazed in workshops when I bring up the idea of a self-portrait assignment, how many people not only are afraid of it, but then a lot of negative self-talk immediately comes up. And a lot of it's tongue-in-cheek, but still there's an element to it that's very dark and very negative, where there's this sort of talk and ideas that are all about not accepting ourselves just at this most basic level of how we appear. The other thing that I've learned in the last 4 or 5 years doing a lot more photography of people and making self-portrait more a part of some workshops, in particular the Next Step Creativity workshops, is that becoming more comfortable with self-portrait is a great way to become more comfortable photographing other people. When we can develop sort of that acceptance and compassion for ourselves, then it helps so much when we go to photograph other people. Because to photograph other people, unless you're just objectifying people, which has been done a lot in the world of photography, and I don't particularly appreciate it myself, that is maybe trying to present people in a very, very extreme way that's not flattering. I'm not going to call any names, but that's been done to almost distraction. If you want to actually make a connection with people and try and present people in a way that is pushing towards what you see as the highest vision they may have for themselves, or sort of the highest vision that you have for them as a photographer, then you have to have compassion for other people. You have to pay attention. You're going to have to spend more time than just taking somebody and sticking them in front of a seamless background and shooting them with all this detail. A great example of a photographer who I think does take the time to show the grace and the dignity of everybody that he photographs is Sebastião Salgado. But the point that I'm trying to make is that that ability to care about other people, to me, has to start with being comfortable with yourself in terms of photographing people. And the other thing, looking at George's picture here, that makes me think of is that you can sort of start small and work your way big. You can start with environmental portraits like this, where you're smaller in the shot, and then come in tighter and tighter and tighter and get more and more comfortable with portraits that are close up. Last thing that I'll say on a very practical level is that when you start to let yourself get into the idea of self-portrait, that you're always available to yourself. You're always there, and so that you can work on these kinds of conceptual shots. The other really interesting thing is that there's a real strong tradition in photography, particularly in the fine art photography world, of this being a motif or a theme for photographers, maybe for their whole life or for a big part of their career. And Cindy Sherman is an example of a photographer who really sort of made this idea of self-portrait as a theme in an artist work, who became very famous as a fine artist, who sort of made this idea very popular. And so just want to say a big thank you to George for creating an image that just on the face of it is very dramatic, very beautiful, for creating an image that's conceptual, that sort of goes beyond the reality of this canyon, and presented it in a way where on the workshop when this came up, people were like, wait a minute, I don't remember this space. And then when he explained what he had done, just very, very powerful, just the abstract of this composite. And also, having the courage to play around with the idea of self-portrait. It's a great assignment. It's something that a lot of people are afraid of. You go past a fear, you can really grow yourself, as a person and as a photographer. Big thank you to George. Big thank you to everybody who participated in our Zion National Park workshop. And have a great weekend, everybody.